Personally, for me, I could never be part of an organization where my responsibility was to train only what's in the curriculum. The problem with teaching only what's inside of a curriculum is that as an instructor for these organizations, a lot of times you had no say in what it is you're teaching. And if you want to change part of what you're teaching, sometimes it's near impossible to do. If you guys want to support the channel, like, subscribe, do all that weird stuff down below. It's absolutely free and it costs you nothing. In this case, this is an active shooter course that is mandated by law to take in the state of Texas if you're an officer. And that means that this was developed not even by a particular agency, but an outside organization, which makes changing it or coming up with better ideas all that more difficult. I'll get into later in this video where I discuss a conversation I had with an instructor that highlights this very issue as it relates to teaching what's in the curriculum, sticking to the curriculum, and not taking the perspective of like, well, I never thought about that. Maybe that is a good idea, or hey, I'll bring that up, right? But if you've been around training enough, especially if you've taken the same class enough, and you look at the training that comes out for said curriculum, let's just say in year 1, and then compare that to what they're teaching in year 3 or 4 and how those differ from one another, you could have been in that first year of that training and you could have brought up something and said, hey, this doesn't make a lot of sense, or I was wondering why we're not doing this way. And they're going to give you an explanation as to kind of why you're wrong and why the way they're teaching it is right. But then you could take that same course 3 years later, and now they have an explanation for why they're not doing the thing that you had brought up in year 1. One of those examples is they used to teach when you get to a threshold and you engage a bad guy inside the room and the bad guy goes down, they wanted the officers to do a blood sweep of their body before they took any further action. And I think it's just kind of reasonable from a human perspective to see why that doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't feel like you're injured. And not just why maybe it doesn't make sense, but understand like they're not going to do that, right? Like you're not going to remember to do that if you don't feel like you need to do that. So maybe that's not a priority. That was something they were teaching in the beginning. If you had brought it up, they probably would have said, no, you need to do that. This is why. And now 3 or 4 years later, they're saying, hey, we've eliminated this and this is why. So I just find that very interesting. Keep in mind that everything that I'm talking about here is from a patrol response perspective, not the tactical team guys responding, not the SWAT guys who train together, but patrol guys who are mandated by law, at least in Texas, to take maybe an 8-hour course once every 2 years or once every 3 years. So that's the extent of their tactical training. That's a really important distinction to make here because it's going to come into play when I talk about some of these other points over here. So a driving force is something that tells you where the bad guy is or around about where you think the bad guy is. So this is basically the layout that we are working with essentially, not to scale obviously, and a indicator of a driving force, the common ones that are used is gunfire, right? So if I enter the hallway here and I hear gunfire, I may not know exactly what room the gunfire is coming from, but based off where I'm standing and where I hear the noise coming from, that's going to give me enough information to push at least a certain part of the way before I need to start being deliberate and checking angles, checking corners, or potentially checking rooms. One of the misconceptions that people think is that when they have a driving force, which again is telling you where the bad guy is or around about where the bad guy is, that they're going to stop and check inside of every room as they're passing by. There has been one time in history that I could find where there has been 2 active shooters inside a location and they were still active when the police arrived and actually went into that location, which was a Walmart. Now, you have to be able to use these probabilities, likelihoods, and statistics to dictate, how you're going to respond or dictate your actions. And so just because there's 1 shooter doesn't mean that there isn't 2, but more likely than not, there's only 1. And it's not that we're completely unaware and unprepared for a second shooter, but we are pushing to where we know the problem is, okay? And so if we enter the hallway and we hear gunfire, we hear screaming, or we see the shooter, obviously, we are going to push immediately to where he is without really much observation in other areas per se. Like if you have a second to take time to kind of check something before you're moving by, okay, I understand that, but otherwise we're pushing directly there. If I enter the hallway and I hear gunfire, but I don't know where the gunfire is coming from, and this has happened to me before in training, where it was coming from a room, I didn't know where the room was, but I knew that it was probably on the other side of this intersection, right? With a high degree of likelihood that that was the case. And so I would probably get here and check here just to verify, and then I would bump across, and then I would start saying, okay, maybe he's in here, let me check if he's in here, right? And still keeping my awareness that he could be somewhere else. That is different from I saw the shooter go in here, right? If I saw the shooter go in here, obviously I'm gonna push directly down. That would be a driving force. One of the things that they are teaching that I don't agree with, and I think we should just eliminate it altogether from our curriculum, is that if you have a driving force, you're gonna push, but if you don't have a driving force, you're gonna wait for backup. So if we show up as the first responding officer and we don't have a driving force, we don't hear screaming, we don't hear gunfire, then maybe it's just because we're at one end of the building and it's occurring at the other end of the building. Or maybe it's because we're standing outside and we decided not to go in because we're still waiting for our backup. If your backup is pulling in the parking lot and you see them or they're running up, okay, I can understand waiting a few seconds to go in. But your responsibility when you get there, whether you have a driving force or not, is determine if there's something actually happening. In a lot of these cases, there is, false calls that, kind of like swatting calls where it's not actually a real event. And so do we need everybody running hot from all over the city and all these different departments coming to this location if it looks like it's business as usual and people are coming and going as normal? Probably not. So you can walk in the office, right, and say, is there anything going on here? No, there's not. Okay, hey, this is a false call. There's nothing going on here. They haven't heard anything. So to stay outside and wait could cause additional problems. But on top of that, just because you don't have a driving force now doesn't mean you can't seek out what I would call maybe a driving force, but seek out a stimulus, right? There are things that you could see that could drive you to a certain point, right? It doesn't mean that the shooter is there, but it could mean, or it does mean, that he was there. And so if I was to enter here and look for a driving force per se, I would move, cover as much area as I can while looking as deep and as far as I can without overcommitting to certain areas, right? They basically teach that if you don't have a driving force, but you know that there's a shooter in the building, that you should start systematically clearing every room. I don't necessarily think that that's the best thing to do. The likelihood that you came inside this room or you entered this building and the first room that you go in, the bad guy is in there, it's unlikely. And what actually can happen, and this did kind of happen in I think it was the Tennessee school shooting, I might have the state wrong, but they came in, they started doing that deliberate clearing, clearing every room, and then they heard the gunfire upstairs, so then they had to go upstairs. What would have been a more ideal approach, in my opinion, is if you enter and you're on the first floor and you have a second floor, is you split the team, right? You say, you 4 guys stay here, we're gonna go upstairs. And the first thing that I would do is immediately push tactically down the hallways to look for something. You might see brass, you might see empty magazines, you might see people that are injured, you might see chairs thrown into the hallway, or something that indicates the shooter was there, right? This is by no means a critique. These officers did an amazing job. This is just the example I'm using in this video. So the officers make entry, and yes, they're looking for the shooter, but they're also looking for a stimulus, something that is out of place. They also are doing what I am advising could be a best practice in certain situations, which is clearing large areas at one time. They enter, they look into the gymnasium, they don't push into the gymnasium, they don't send officers through the gymnasium to go check the locker rooms. They look in the gymnasium, they don't see anything out of place, so they keep pushing. Then they start working room to room. As they're working, if they were to come to a T intersection and they saw a person down at the end of the hallway, they would say, hey, let's push right. And so as it was about 2.5 minutes into their clearing, they start hearing the gunfire upstairs, and then they start pushing upstairs. As soon as you enter, if you have 2 floors, if you have the manpower, you have at least 4 guys, you can send, hey, 2 guys go upstairs, 2 of us will start working down here. And again, clearing these large areas at one time could give you the stimulus you need and start pointing you in the right direction. Even if I was entering by myself, I would not start clearing individual rooms by myself. I would try to clear or cover visually these large spaces to see if I could pick up on a stimulus. If I happen to find a stairwell, or I enter on the first floor and there's a stairwell right next to me, I'm looking long, let me go up the stairs real quick and look long down that hallway to see if there is something that drives me in a certain direction. And so this is just the general layout of my kids' school, where you enter, there's a big gymnasium, and then as you keep walking, there's just long hallways, right? So if I didn't have a driving force, but I believe that there was an active shooter in the building or something happening, after I enter, I'm not gonna go start clearing deep into the offices, right? What I'm gonna do is I'm going to push up to this gymnasium area, and because I can look inside this gym from the doors and check to see if there's anything out of place, I can do that from out here. I can not clear per se this giant area, but I can say it doesn't look like the shooter was here. And then I'm gonna keep pushing down the hallway, again, tactically, and I'm gonna look down these hallways, right? I can cover large areas at one time by looking down these hallways to see if I find something. Now, if I enter a building or an area and I do see what might be considered a driving force, this is actually different than knowing exactly where the shooter is, right? If 5 minutes has passed before I arrived on this call, right, then you have to consider the delay in the call, how those calls are coming in, etc. Just because I see a body in the hallway does not mean that this is where the shooter is, okay? And so what happened in one of the scenarios was me and another officer entered into the hallway, and we saw the person that was down. And so what we're gonna do is we are going to push directly to that, but we're gonna actually kind of consider that the suspect could be, the shooter could be in other locations. So this isn't a very, hey, let's take our time at these doors and let's be deliberate when we're looking in here, and you get long and you get my back and then we'll bump over here and look in here. It's not that. It's just we're moving with a sense of urgency, with the awareness that the suspect could be anywhere. And so what happened was we entered the hallway and we saw the person down and said, hey, we're gonna push to that person that's down. And we started moving, and the whole time that we're moving, the instructor's yelling, driving force, driving force. And I'm telling the other officer, slow down, relax, slow down. And because in my mind, I'm thinking the shooter could be anywhere. We know he was here. It does not mean he is here. And so we're gonna bypass things. We're gonna check off on things as we're going by. And once we got here, I'm of course looking this direction, and the other officer is basically standing right next to me, just looking this way. So I have to tell him, hey, push across the hall, look over here, right? And now he's looking over here, and then we, kind of give it up to one another. And I check this way, I don't know what he did over here, but then we're pushing down here. But the entire time we're doing that, the instructor is yelling, driving force. A driving force is telling you either where the shooter is or around about where you think the shooter is. And so I wouldn't consider that a driving force in the context in which driving force is taught. So if you respond to an active shooter and you don't have a driving force, I would teach that it's your responsibility to find something that's going to indicate that there is a shooting happening and where you could potentially locate that shooter. This works really well in schools, right, where you have these long hallways or these large venues. It may not work so well if you're talking about a very complex structure, right? If I entered a complex structure where it's like you could go left, you could go right, you have to walk upstairs and then you come back down, that might not be a scenario where you want to just start wandering off because you're not clearing or, looking at large spaces at a time, right? So that might be a situation where, okay, I came in here, this layout's real big and real confusing and there's twists and turns everywhere. Let me take a room real quick and then let everybody know where I'm at, and then maybe continue to start work until your backup comes. But I believe that we should just eliminate waiting for backup from the curriculum altogether. Telling officers, if you have a driving force, you're gonna push directly there. But if you don't hear anything or see anything, you're gonna wait for backup. I think that's the wrong message, and we should just remove it from the curriculum altogether. As a patrol officer who has experience doing these things, to me, everything is a one-man response, right? Most of the stuff that you see on the internet is all talked about and taught from a team perspective. I'm gonna take this room, I'm gonna go this way, run this route, you're gonna run this way. When you're an officer, you have no idea the capability of the other officers that show up. You don't know who they are sometimes, and you just don't know what they're going to do. And so one of the issues with responding or training active shooter and trying to patrol officers and trying to teach them team tactics. One of the hazards or the dangers in teaching that to a group of officers who are going to show up every 2 years or every 3 years is like you may literally be making it more dangerous for them. And the reason is because, for example, at the beginning of the class, they are talking to us about, or teaching us, I guess you could say, about how you're going to, as a two-man, approach this door and engage a shooter together, like who's covering what, where you're looking, etc., right? With also the mention that within the class that they're teaching, they literally have officers almost shooting one another, okay? Because they get excited, they see the shooter, one has priority, one doesn't, and then in the class, in training, they're almost shooting one another. So then what it comes down to is we're basically teaching patrol officers tactics that they can't even execute in the class that we're teaching it. And then we expect that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years later that they're going to be involved in something like this and it's somehow going to mitigate that risk. I don't think so. So everything to me, as I respond to these things, I do it as a one-man. I have no expectations of what somebody else is going to do. If I enter a room, I just assume nobody's coming with me. If I, enter a corner fed room and I run the rabbit, I just assume that there isn't a guy that's going to come in after me and pick up where the threat is, okay? So we should consider actually, you can have other officers there while you're training, but just consider that when you're training officers who don't work together in a team, what they're actually going to be given when they respond to situations like this. One of the issues that over and over again these officers fell into is when they're rushing down to where they know the shooter is down the hall. Obviously the intent behind the scenario is that you hear the gunfire or you see the shooter going here, and now you have a driving force, and now you need to run down here and engage the shooter here. Every officer that was in my group either got shot at by the suspect or was shot by the suspect. I didn't even know that the suspect was told, the role player was told to engage officers, because when I went, he didn't have time to shoot me. And I just thought, oh, he didn't, he didn't have a simunition gun. That was my thought. But then when we got back to the staging area, everyone's like, oh man, I got shot. And I was like, oh, he's shooting at you? And they're like, yeah. I was like, okay, well, let me explain this to you guys. So I basically told them, listen, when you get down here, you have to slow yourself down and you have to start taking up parts of this room from the outside, right? Everybody knows how to do this, how to work the threshold, and don't immediately overexpose yourself to the door and get into a gunfight. And that's what they were doing. That is bad, obviously, because the likelihood that you're going to be hit rises, but it's also bad from a marksmanship and accountability perspective. You're not going to perform well when you are immediately exposed to, well, traditionally they don't perform well, when you're immediately exposed to a threat and that threat is shooting at you before you're shooting at him, and now you have to come up and get your sights. That's not what they're doing. They're not getting their sights. They're pointing the gun and pulling the trigger until the guy stops shooting at them. That's what they're going to do in real life. So if you can get to this point here, slow yourself down and take up pieces of this room. And it doesn't have to be a real slow, oh, let me lean over, let me get a little bit more. It's somewhere between that and a hasty threshold evaluation where you're just moving all the way across, okay? Every time that I did this, I shot the shooter before he shot me. He saw me, he came up, and I was already shooting him. So that would be my advice there. I think officers would actually get more out of learning how to use thresholds to their advantage and learn how to slow themselves down by just having them move down to where, wherever you put the target, wherever the shooter is, and then just move a target throughout the room where they have to continuously work the threshold and engage this target. That, I think, is more beneficial than the one time they, by themselves, get to run down there, jump in front of the threshold, and then get into a gunfight. We don't want to get into gunfights. We want to get into shootings. We were told that when responding to an active shooter as a one-man, and again, I consider everything that I'm doing in this situation to be as if I'm doing it by myself, is that you had 3 options to enter a corner-fed room. You could run the rabbit, as they like to call it, and they said the benefit of doing this is that you're a moving target, and this makes it more difficult for the suspect to engage you. but also acknowledge that cops don't train to shoot laterally, so it makes it more difficult for you to shoot the suspect. They said an option was to move to the center of the room. I didn't really understand how this in any way was advantageous, so I'm not even going to attempt to explain that to you. But then they said the third option was to enter the room and move directly towards the threat. Of course, this is all after you do your threshold evaluation and you've cleared the majority of the room and you believe that the shooter is here or the shooter could be over there. And so I asked the question, already knowing kind of the response that I was going to get, and that question was, if an option is to move directly towards the threat and get closer to the problem, why is it not an option to continue to use the threshold to your advantage and take a step or a half step inside the room and focus your attention to where the suspect is? And the reasoning that I got was that you'd be in the way for other responding officers and that we just don't fight from here. And the real reason that this isn't an option, as I alluded to in the beginning of the video, is because that's not in the curriculum yet. And they can't teach you something that isn't in the curriculum because obviously there could be liability reasons for doing so. But this is one of those things that they're telling you you can't do now, and at some point, maybe a year or two, whenever that is, maybe after some people test it and they become believers, they might say, okay, hey, now this is also an option, right? The last thing that you want to do is enter the room with somebody who has a gun and expect that you're going to win that, especially by yourself. Why might it be more advantageous for you to take a half step into the threshold and focus on where the threat is instead of dumping into the room? Well, that's because when you dump into the room, you make yourself a fully available target. And when you take a half step into the threshold and focus on where the threat is, you are using some level of cover and or concealment versus utilizing none. And the other benefit is that if you are by yourself and you execute this move right here and something bad happens to you, like you do happen to get shot, there's a good chance you won't end up in the room with the shooter, which still means that if you're alive, you might have a fighting chance if that shooter decides that he's gonna advance on you and come outside the threshold. And if there's additional officers that are showing up and you're shot or you're killed, you will be shot or killed out here. And that means that they're gonna get to you faster and probably have a better idea of where the shooter actually is versus you going into the room and just simply getting killed. Now, in the Tree of Life Synagogue active shooter event, the point guy who entered the room and ran the rabbit got shot 12 times, okay? And the person that came in there after him couldn't identify where the threat was and couldn't engage the threat. Why is that? Well, because we look at everything in these clean-cut, corner-fed, center-fed rooms, and that's a lot of times not the reality that we actually face. And so in this situation, you got tables and chairs, and you have all these things in the room, right? And what appears to be a corner-fed room on the outside looking in happens to not actually be a true center or a true corner-fed room. And actually what there was instead was basically a L-shaped part of the room, and this is where the shooter is. And so you have the point guy going in, running the rabbit, being engaged by the shooter, going down, and then you have the number 2 guy who is supposed to come in and take care of the problem, right? That's what they tell you. Couldn't figure out or couldn't identify where the shooter was and engage the shooter. On top of that, this suspect barricaded himself inside this classroom and set this classroom up in such a way that it took officers away from the ability to apply the fundamentals of CQB. Immediately upon entry here, you could not move here, right? So even if the officer came in after the number 1 guy went here, the number 2 guy came here, he can't even run his route to close the distance to get to where the shooter is. Ultimately, in the end of that, there was a bunch of gunfire exchange. The shooter was injured. They backed out of the room. The officer survived. Another officer was shot in the hand trying to pulling his buddy out. And they ended up backing out of the room, and this guy just gave up after they basically talked him into giving up. And so my suggestion to you is, my advice when you're going to expose yourself to a corner-fed room is to get out of this mindset of like, oh, I have this clean corner-fed room. I'm going to come in here, run the rabbit. I know it's dangerous. I might get shot, but don't worry, the number 2 guy is going to come in after me. That's not the reality for most patrol officers. You have no idea what the other person is going to do, and that other person simply might be a hazard to what it is you're trying to do. Everybody knows the Uvalde active shooter incident and what happened in that situation, right? And this is probably what's going to happen to most officers who find themselves in a situation where they're approaching a threshold and they're taking gunfire. And this is why there needs to be a significant amount of more emphasis on fighting from the threshold, because it's the thing that your body is going to tell you is the right thing to do in that moment. And so in the active shooter situation in Uvalde, you had officers approach the threshold and then take gunfire from the suspect inside as they're approaching, and then back out and never approach the threshold again. Maybe those officers thought in their mind that the only thing they could do was go inside the room, which is, you know, when you have inexperienced officers who don't train and you don't know if the people who are with you are trained either, you're telling them that they have to go inside the room. It's just a difficult ask, okay? But it doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do. Instead, what they could have done was continued to come up here and work this threshold and keep the shooter busy. If the shooter is shooting at you, right, that probably means you have an opportunity to shoot at him, but if he's shooting at you, that also means he's not actively killing in that moment other people. If you guys want to support the channel, make sure you like, subscribe, do all that weird stuff down below. Anything I didn't cover in this video that comes up in the comment section, I will make sure to address it there.